Okay, great. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. My name is Tim Schaefer. I'm the Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission. Welcome to this meeting of the Commission's Fisheries and Hatcheries Committee. This meeting is being broadcasted on Facebook Live in real time, and a recording of the meeting will be immediately available on the agency's Facebook page after the meeting ends. A recording will also be posted on the Commission's YouTube page within a few days. A few logistical items before we kick it off. One, for the commissioners and staff on the line, please be mindful of your mute button. Have it off when you want to speak, but please leave the mute function on at all other times. And also, commissioners and the public will notice that the order of the agenda was adjusted slightly to make the topics flow more seamlessly. We did that in cooperation with Rick Kaufman, who's the chair of the committee. And with that, I'll turn it over to Rick.
Thanks, Tim. And before we get started with the meeting, I'd just like to say on behalf of all the commissioners, I'd like to thank all the anglers and boaters across Pennsylvania for their support this past year. Our numbers were fantastic, and we hope the fishing and the boating opportunities that we brought were a bright spot for everyone this past year, and I hope it can continue into this year, and we wish everybody well. So with that, let's get started with a roll call. I'll turn it over to Wayne Melnick.
Good afternoon. This is Wayne Melnick, Chief Counsel for the Commission. I will now call the roll. President Lewis.
Present.
Committee Chairman Kaufman. Committee Chairman Kaufman. Committee Vice Chair Pastore.
Present.
Commissioner Anderson.
Present.
Commissioner Hassar.
Here.
Commissioner Brock. He could not be in attendance. Chairman Kaufman, we have a quorum.
Hey, thank you.
Chairman, this is the time where I report public comments to the commissioners and staff. Because of COVID considerations and not having the ability to have the public come in, we have made a practice of opening a telephone line immediately preceding our public meetings. We did that this week. We opened the line for public comments on Monday and Tuesday. However, we received no public comments, so I have no comments to report. Next slide, please.
Okay, thank you, Wayne. As you can see, these are our four main topics for today. First of all, we're going to have an overview discussion of the agenda items planned for our January commission meeting. We will not be taking any votes this afternoon. We will also, part of the presentation will be former Brook trout enhancement angling regulations and evaluations of their efficiency. And this next would be the select fisheries topics for our April commission meeting presented by Dave Neihart. And finally, an announcement of a virtual fisheries summit coming up later on this year. So with that, let's begin our presentations. And I'm going to turn it over to Chris Kuhn.
Thank you, Commissioner Kaufman. My name is Chris Kuhn. I'm the Director of the Bureau of Fisheries, and I'm going to be taking you through the agenda items for the January 25th, 2021 Commission meeting here at the end of the month. There will be opportunity for questions and discussion after we get through each item as needed, and we'll have the opportunity to do that. So I'm going to jump right in. A lot of these are review as we've seen them in proposed rulemaking in the past, but we want to go through and talk through the details here this afternoon. So first up, we have final rulemaking in an amendment to 6524, which is miscellaneous special regulations, that is to remove Opossum Lake in Cumberland County from those regulations. So Opossum Lake is a 47-acre impoundment in Cumberland County. It was dewatered completely in 2008 for dam and spillway repairs, and it was refilled during the spring of 2013. Since 2012, the approach that we had taken with Possum Lakes and many other waters coming back online after repairs are made is we moved that into miscellaneous special regulations, which essentially allows for the harvest of trout under Commonwealth Inland Waters angling regulation, but no harvest of other fish species. Next slide, please. And so the proposal here today is to remove opossum from this program, and the reason for doing so is that during the period between refill and now, staff have evaluated the populations at opossum and determined that they have progressed to the point that they now can sustain a level of limited harvest. And so we plan to roll the lake, if removed from miscellaneous special regulations, now into one of the Commission's existing warm and cool water programs. That is to say, we plan to move opossum into Big Bass program as well as the Panfish Enhancement program. And at the January 2021 quarterly commission meeting, staff plan to recommend that we remove. This is a stepwise process where we'll remove first and then ask to designate into those programs. We have posted this announcement in the Pennsylvania Bulletin on October 3rd, and we have not received any public comments regarding this proposal. And it should be noted that if the bass populations, black bass and panfish, specifically crappies, are moved into the Panfish Enhancement, all other species would be managed with Commonwealth Inland Waters angling regulations. And so before we give opportunity for comment here, I'm going to go into the designations on this one. So next slide, please. And this also was posted in the Pennsylvania Bulletin on December 12th. However, in this case, the public comment period is still open. A final comment summary is not provided here, but we will be providing those public comments during the January 25th commission meeting. And at that meeting, we will recommend to move Opossum Lake into the Big Bass program and Panfish Enhancement program for crappies. You will note that our Panfish Enhancement program can also apply for other species or species groups, including sunfish, which would include, in this case, bluegill and pumpkin seed, as well as yellow perch. However, we did not choose to take that approach with Possum Lake based on the characteristics of the fishery and the notion that special regulations apply specifically to waters based on their individual characteristics. So at this time, I will. That's the end of this item at this point.
Is there any questions, comments for Chris on this proposal from anyone on the committee or in other commissioners? Okay, hearing none, take it back to Chris and move on to the next slide.
Okay, next up, we have a very similar action, however, at a different lake also, but with a similar timeline as Opossum, just a year apart. So we have Lake Perez, which is located in Huntington County. It's a 72-acre impoundment that is owned by Pennsylvania State University. It was completely dewatered in spring of 2009, and refill occurred in 2014. And similar to opossum, it was managed under miscellaneous special regulations, as I previously described, for Opossum Lake since 2015. Next slide. And so again, staff have monitored the populations in Lake Perez, and based on the characteristics of the fishery there, we feel that it's time to move this lake into one of the existing warm water programs that we have, and remove it from these miscellaneous special regulations. So a notice of proposed rulemaking was published on October 3rd, 2020 in the Pennsylvania Bulletin, and we did not receive any public comments regarding this proposal. At the January 2021 Commission meeting on the 25th, staff planned to recommend the Commission adopt the amendment as set forth in the notice of proposed rulemaking, which is to remove these miscellaneous special regulations from opossum to facilitate transition to another warm water program, specifically panfish enhancement for both sunfish and crappies. Next slide, please. And so this is the next step in the process, as previously described for opossum and noted here on the last slide for Perez. We have posted a notice of designation in the Pennsylvania Bulletin on December 12th. This public comment period is still open, so a summary is not provided here today, but one will be provided at the January 25th meeting, when we plan to recommend that the Commission add Lake Perez to the Panfish Enhancement Program for sunfish and crappies. If adopted, this designation will go into effect upon publication of second notice in the Pennsylvania Bulletin. And here, again, you will notice that this is a similar approach to opossum, but different in the sense that with opossum, we're going to recommend to add it to big bass and panfish enhancement for crappies. Here with Perez, we are only recommending to add it to panfish enhancement for sunfish and crappies, but not to the big bass program. Again, an example of special regulation application, the differences among the waters that we manage. And so that's all I have on this portion of the presentation.
Any questions for Chris? Point? Okay, hearing none, let's move on, Chris.
Okay, so next up, this is the beginning of the process. We saw towards the end of the process of when a lake is refilled and the fishery is rebuilt. We have a situation here with Whipple Lake in Huntington County. It's a 17-acre impoundment that's owned by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and managed by the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. Whipple Lake was dewatered, completely dewatered in 2019 to remove sediment and complete structural improvements to the dam. The sediment removal and dam structure improvements were completed in 2020, and we expect refilling to be ongoing now or very soon into the future. Next slide. So in this case, we're recommending that we add Whipple Lake to the miscellaneous special regulations, and that is to add the regulation that we would have the trout population or the stock trout open to harvest through Commonwealth Inland Waters angling regulations with catch and release of all other species. A notice of proposed rulemaking was published on October 3rd. The Commission did not receive any public comments regarding this proposal. So at the January 25th quarterly Commission meeting, we will ask the Commission to adopt the amendment set forth in the notice of proposed rulemaking, which is to add Whipple to the miscellaneous special regulation program. If adopted, it will go into effect upon publication of a second notice in the Pennsylvania Bulletin.
Thanks again, Chris. Any questions in regards to Whipple Lake? Okay, hearing none, we'll move on to our next slide, and it'll be the final rulemaking for Class A wild trout stream.
And so this is the proposed amendment to 57.8, Code 57.8A, which is Class A wild trout streams. We talked about this in a different context slightly in July, and came back with an altered proposal under proposed rulemaking for this amendment in October. And now we're at the next step in the process to consider it for final rulemaking. You received more detailed presentations on this topic than what I'm going to provide here today, but we'll provide some cursory information on this one. Next slide. And so historically, there have been very few Class A stream sections where stocking has been considered or warranted. So from the historical context, for the most part, we did not entertain stocking Class A's up until 2015, at which point in 2015, the language to 57.8A was revised to allow for continued stocking if the executive director received approval from the Board of Commissioners to do so. We had internal decision-making criteria to consider streams that would qualify for that. We still have that, and subsequently after that amendment in 2015, 13 stream sections that were stocked by the PFBC, Fish and Boat Commission, that is, that were continued to be stocked, but also designated as Class A. Next slide. And so as we move through the subsequent years since those were designated, it became apparent that there may be some other additional scenarios that we would want to consider for continued stocking of Class A wild trout streams, knowing that the vast majority of the ones out there are best managed for wild trout without stocking, but there are some exceptions that we would like to consider and be able to do so in a transparent format and also follow the amendment that was made in 2015 by seeking board approval. Some scenarios that we believe should consider continued stocking of Class A's are pre-existing youth fishing derbies and special use areas that were properly permitted by the commission and have a history of more than one past occurrence. I think that's pretty straightforward. These are your youth fishing derbies on small portions of Class A streams. They're typically time limited, so they occur on a weekend or a day on a very small portion of a Class A stream section. The second category is pre-existing private stockings or stockings on private property on a recently designated, that is within 1 year of posting in the Pennsylvania Bulletin, Class A stream sections. These sections would have to have been closed to public angling at the time of Class A designation and at least since 2010 with verifiable stocking records and have a history of more than one past occurrence. In this situation, this encompasses the situation where you may have a stream that is recently designated Class A and a landowner who has a private stretch of that water that flows through his property that's not open to the public, that has stocked this in the past and can verify stocking records and would like to continue to do so on his property. That's what this scenario accounts for. Next slide, please. And so the third scenario or criteria is basically the criteria that we had applied to the 13 Class A stream sections that are currently stocked by the Fish and Boat Commission. We don't believe there's a lot of them out there that would qualify at this point in addition to those 13, but we would like the opportunity to use this criteria to consider on a case-by-case basis if some should arise. So essentially, it would be a stream section would have to meet these sub-criteria that are outlined here through A, B, C, D, and E, and that is a stream section stocked with adult trout the year prior to designation as Class A. So this would be stocked with adult trout by the PFBC the year prior. Also, we would have to have data that demonstrates that angler use and in the stream section equals or exceeds the 50th percentile, or it's in a special regulation program that shows that it's a high use area for stock trout. Additionally, if stocking were to continue, we would limit the species stock to one that's different from the primary component of the wild trout population. So these are exclusively rather brown trout populations. So we would not stock brown trout in there. It would likely be rainbow as we do in the 13 Class A stream sections that we currently stock as the commission. Additionally, stocking numbers and frequency are not to exceed those of the year prior to the Class A designations, and stream sections managed for wild brook trout are not eligible. The only real difference we have here with this is we've revised this criteria that staff have used to include cooperative nurseries and/or a private group or individual, as opposed to just PFBC stocking or commission stocking, rather. And so a scenario where that may play out would be where we have a stretch of stream that's stocked by the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission. We have data on it to show that it is a high angler use area. It meets the other criteria there. However, during that time period before it was designated Class A, perhaps someone or an organization stocked that stretch of water also, say, for example, for a fishing derby. It may not be a youth fishing derby, but it's a fishing derby. It meets all those criteria, so we would consider that as a scenario for continued stocking. Next slide, please. And so finally, this brings in the fourth scenario or criteria brings in the aspect of previously received an exemption or a special activities permit from the commission. And we have it time limited, so that would be between 2010 and present, it says here, but it should read more likely the time of the amendment. So if this were adopted, it would be between 2010 and the time of the amendment. So this is basically, if you think about this in terms of the exemption aspect of it, prior to 2015, the executive director did not have to seek board approval, and there may be some rare circumstances where an exemption was granted. The other aspect of it would be a special activities permit. So we issue special activities permits for things such as children's derbies or other activities. So perhaps something like a scenario like that had played out. Next slide, please. And so this is basically a slide that summarizes the benefits of this approach. We look at this as a common sense approach for dealing with a complex situation. In the past, we've had the criteria for the 13 stock Class A's internally that were not public facing. This provides a mechanism for transparent, timely, and consistent consideration for these stocking exemptions. And I'll explain what that means here towards the end a little bit. But also the criteria, it should be noted, the criteria are designed to keep rare exemptions rare. For the vast majority of our Class A waters, we believe that the best management approach is to manage solely for the perpetuation of the wild trout fishery. Again, considerations would only be given to new requests for continued stocking in stream sections within 1 year of the section being designated as a Class A and posted in the Pennsylvania Bulletin. Should an exemption be granted, the Commission would determine the species of trout, number of trout, and frequency of trout consistent with stocking strategies and historical stocking rates. So, for example, as it pertains to this bullet, the way we envision this to play out would be a scenario, say we have a stream that we grant, the Commission grants a stocking exemption to continue stocking on a Class A. Once that's approved, then a stocking authorization letter would be provided to the entity that details the limitations of that continuance of stocking. Stream sections with wild brook trout populations that have not previously been granted an exemption will not be considered for continued stocking. And of course, this remains the same as the executive director will obtain Commission approval prior to consideration of stocking of Class A. And the transparency aspect of it that I mentioned is not only this process, but also these criteria will be detailed in the operational guidelines for the management of trout fisheries in Pennsylvania, 5th edition. That's currently in the works right now, and it's planned for release in the very near future. So that will be out there for folks to see. Next slide. And so this is the actual proposed amendment. The underlined and bolded language there is what we're planning to request the Commission consider amending, and that essentially is to memorialize the criteria in the operational guidelines. Next slide. And so I noticed the proposed rulemaking for this was published in the Pennsylvania Bulletin on December 5th. We received a total of 6 public comments regarding the proposal. 4 opposed the proposal, 1 supports the proposal, and 1 comment did not pertain. At the January 2021 Commission meeting on the 25th, we plan to recommend the Commission adopt the amendment as set forth in the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. If adopted, the amendment will go into effect upon publication of a second notice in the Bulletin.
Hey, take a breath, Chris. You know, you guys have been working on this for a while and appreciate your effort that went into it. Commissioners, is there any questions, comments on this item?
Yeah, this is Commissioner Hussar. Chris, you mentioned the frequency on about 2 slides ago, the stocking frequency. I guess derbies are probably a 1-day stocking. Is that a good assumption?
Yeah, for the most part, Commissioner. So that's correct. Typically, the derbies are time limited, one-time stockings. Where when I reference the frequency, that more has to do like with the Commission stocked waters, say for example the 13 Class A's. So that would be a scenario where we have a Commission stocked water that receives a preseason and an in-season or 2 in-season stockings, say. So we would look at that and not exceed, if we would continue stocking, we would not exceed that stocking frequency or the number of fish.
Okay. And then I guess that said, on a private entity, which was mentioned, which may occur on an exemption, they could virtually stock as much as they want a year, correct? With the exemption.
Well, we would recommend in our authorization letter that they follow what they've done with past practice, so not to exceed. And so if you recall that aspect, I don't have it in front of me right now, but it basically states that the stocking records would need to be verifiable to and show a history of more than one past occurrence in order to qualify for consideration. So when we see that, we would then recommend in the authorization letter that be followed and not exceeded into the future if an exemption were granted.
So that's, and I guess I should clarify that. I guess I'm talking this in regards to specific numbers of fish. And I guess that's my follow-up question. With these exemptions, are we getting specific data indicating the number of fish and the species per area? Or we get from the people that are applying for these exemptions?
Well, right now, if you're referring to the next topic coming up next with those waters, we could cover that then. But I mean, right now we're looking at a backlog of potential special activities permits for the most part that have been issued, and so we have some information on those special activities permits.
Okay. Just in regards to those special activity permits, then, do we know? I mean, if they're stocking 600, 1,000, 300 rainbows, brooks, whatever? Is that something that we research and have the data for, or is that something we're even looking at, or is that part of the process? I don't know if I'm explaining this right. Yeah.
Yeah, it's certainly part of the process, and you know, our Bureau of Law Enforcement issues the permits. However, they give us the opportunity in fisheries to review permits as well, and a lot of times some of those permits will have numbers of fish on there. And if there's a number of fish that seems excessive or a species of fish that's undesirable, we'll make recommendations to alter those if we can. That is a perfect example in illustrating the need for stocking authorization. But in the case of the potential exemptions that we're about to go through, I mean, for the most part, you're looking at time limited. It does have the number of fish on those derbies, and they're generally in the 200, 350, 400 range, that kind of thing, depending on the length of stream, which is typically also a very small length of stream.
That's fine, Chris. Thanks for the clarification there.
John Anderson here. I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Okay. With the executive director should get commission approval. I guess my concern in that would be, how are we going to do this with getting commission approval? Are we going to wait to run it through a quarterly meeting, or would it be something that would be handled by a notational vote? I guess I'll use this spring, for example, and let's assume that we do not have COVID and people can apply for special activity permits. Just like we have the January commission meeting coming up here towards the end of the month, but a group may not apply for their permit until early February, and they'd want to have something right after the opening of trout season. But yet, we don't have a spring commission meeting until late April or early May. There might be an issue there with the timing of it if we're going to run it through a quarterly commission meeting. Personally, I'd just like the executive director to be able to use his discretion there. or even with the consulting with the district commissioner. We had talked on that here some time ago, but that's my question for you there.
So, Don, I would say it, you know, without having gone through the process yet with this, I would think that a notational vote would be acceptable, but we would try to do these in the most transparent forum that we could, which would be the quarterly commission meetings. And this is the first round of this is coming actually on the 25th, and that's what we're going to talk about next.
Okay.
Hey, thanks, Eric. Don, anybody else? Not, we'll move on to the next item.
Okay, so next up, just right into this same topic, we grouped these together, as Tim said, not by action type, but by topic. And so, as I mentioned before, we have a package that we're going to bring before the commission on the 25th, which are proposed exemptions to allow for the continued stocking of 12 Class A stream sections. There are actually 13 exemptions because there are 2 events. So they're event specific. There are 2 events on the Latort Spring Run in Cumberland County. The vast majority of these you'll see are associated with youth fishing derbies. So these are the ones that we know of, and staff took the time to reach out to the event organizers and speak with them and engage the desire to continue this or options for moving to another location. And these are the ones that came up that we're going to bring before the commission to decide upon whether we're going to continue stocking. We had Beaver Run in Clearfield County, Freeman Run in Potter County, McElhatton Creek in Clinton County, Yellow Creek in Bedford County, and these are section specific. I should note I'm not saying the section, but I could. Latort Spring Run, Section 3 in Cumberland County. That's the one that I referenced for two separate individual events. Laurel Run in Berks County, an unnamed trip to the Tulpahawken in Berks, and Wyomissing Creek in Berks County. So these are the ones that would meet the criteria that I previously described on the last portion of the presentation under the youth fishing derby or the first criteria. Next slide. Next up, we have general fishing derby. This is a fishing derby that occurs on Kishacoillis Creek, and it was actually the scenario that I tried to explain criteria number 3 in the context of. And so Kishacoillis Creek Section 5 is a stocked Class A by the commission. It meets all the criteria, the high angler use, so on and so forth that we previously outlined. And it was also stocked by a private entity to support a fishing derby there. And so that qualifies under that category. Next would be exclusive use area or children disabled fishing area on Marvin Creek. And then we have 2 previously issued exemptions, one on Cross Fork and one on Warriors Mark Run that we will be asking the commissioners to decide upon. Next slide, please. And so a notice of proposed rulemaking was published in the bulletin on December 19th. That comment period remains open, so we don't have a comment summary here today, but we will have one for the commissioners during the January 25th meeting. And so at that meeting, we will ask that the commission approve the 13 exemptions to 57.8A to allow for the continued stocking of 12 Class A stream sections. And so we plan to bring this to the commission as a package of waters However, if there is concern over individual waters, we can parse those out at that time.
Okay, any further comments, thoughts on this item? Okay, hearing none. Let's move on to the next one, proposed rulemaking.
So next up, we have proposed rulemaking to amend our all-tackle trophy trout and trophy trout artificial lures only. This is one of many items that we identified in our trout plan, basically from 2020 to 2024, that was recently finalized in October. Next slide. And so in that strategic plan for the management of trout fisheries in Pennsylvania, issue 15 specifically identified the need to evaluate a program that's been in place for some time to determine whether it needs refinement or determine its continuance. And so currently the trophy trout regulation program allows for the harvest of 2 trout per day greater than 14 inches from the opening day of trout season through Labor Day, with catch and release angling the remainder of the year. This regulation was established decades ago, actually on Penns Creek Section 3, when a 14-inch trout was substantially larger than an average size fish. And at the time, most of these waters were or some of these waters were on stock fisheries. And now how the program has evolved, we have 11 waters in there and 10 of them are wild trout waters. Additionally, you know, right now the view of anglers is that a 14-inch trout no longer constitutes a trophy for most anglers. Perhaps in the past it didn't, but as I mentioned previously, this was a lot larger than the fish that were stocked by the commission at the time, and some of these waters were indeed stock trout waters. However, these regulations tend to focus harvest on our largest fish in the population and tend to provide an adequate protection to those larger individuals. And so there may be an alternative regulation that still allows anglers to harvest a large trout if they so choose, knowing that most folks today practice voluntary catch and release, but provides increased protection to most of the large fish in the populations. Next slide. And so for those reasons, Commission staff developed a recommendation to implement an updated trophy trout regulation. This new regulation, what it would look like would be, it would be a reduced creel going from 2 fish to 1 fish per day and an increased size. So going from 14 inches, greater than or equal to 14 inches to greater than or equal to 18 inches. So it would be 1 trout per day, greater than or equal to 18 inches, again from the opening day of trout season through Labor Day, with catch and release angling the remainder of the year. This size and creel limit was intensely researched by staff through analysis of commission data, review of trout regulations in other states, and discussions among fisheries managers in Pennsylvania and elsewhere. You'll recall that in 2017, we held a wild trout summit during which we had a questionnaire about things that one of which was what do anglers consider to be a trophy trout? And this was actually identified as one of the most commonly viewed size ranges as a trophy trout, around 18 inches. It should be noted as well that a size restriction greater than 18 inches would essentially function as a catch and release regulations, because there are very few fish in the populations through Pennsylvania waters that we have through electrofishing data that are larger than 18 inches. if implemented, staff will evaluate the 10 waters. Essentially, I mentioned that there were 11. We would focus our evaluation on the 10 wild trout waters that are currently in the regulations and recommend the appropriate management program for each individual water moving forward. Next slide. And so because this is proposed rulemaking, we don't have any public comment yet, but at the January 25th quarterly commission meeting, we plan to recommend the commission approve the publication of a notice of proposed rulemaking containing the amendment, basically 1 trout per day greater than 18 inches from the opening day of trout season through Labor Day with catch and release the remainder of the year. And this would open up the public comment period and bring this back as final rulemaking to consider if it passes proposed, probably in July of 2021, with anticipated implementation January 1st, 2022, if approved. And so with that, I can take any questions or comments.
I was a little slow in the mute button there, Chris.
That's all right. It happens to the best of us.
Any comments, questions, Chris, on this one? Okay. Moving on. Hearing no other comments, questions, one more thing, Chris. That's the next slide.
Okay, we have the standard proposed changes to the list of Class A wild trout streams and our additions to the wild trout list on the next slide. First, I'll go through the Class A's. This is something that you will have all the information provided to you regarding the individual waters being proposed for designation. I will note that none of the waters that are being proposed for designation are stocked by the Fish and Boat Commission or a cooperative nursery, nor are we aware of any permits regarding DEP on any of these waters that would be affected. And so the notice of proposed designation was published on November 21st, and the public comment period is still ongoing. A final comment summary will be provided during the meeting on the 25th, at which time we plan to ask the commission to add 25 new stream sections to its list of Class A wild trout streams. If approved, these will go into effect upon publication of a second notice in the bulletin.
Okay, any comments, questions? Chris, on this one? Not. I think Chris has one more item for the next slide. Be up for wild trout.
Okay, yeah. Next up, we have Class A proposed, or not Class A, I'm sorry. I meant to say classification of wild trout streams, proposed additions, revisions, and an amendment. And so again, the notice of these designations was posted in the Pennsylvania Bulletin on November 21st. The comment period is still open, but we plan to provide and will provide a summary of those comments at the meeting on the 25th, at which time we plan to recommend that the commission add 26 new waters to the list of wild trout streams, revise the section limits of 8 waters, and amend the name of 1 currently listed water. If approved, these would go into effect on publication of a second notice. And I will mention that the additions are pretty straightforward, and I'll just note that the 8 water, or the revisions to the section limit, that is the usual extension of the stock trout, or stock trout, a wild trout section rather. and we have one amendment to a name that does not affect the length or the actual stream. It's actually where we have a stream, the headwaters of a stream was improperly named, and we're just renaming it essentially. And that concludes the agenda items for January 25th, 21 quarterly commission meeting.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Before we pass the baton on to Jason, anything else for Chris on any of the items he brought up before we move on to our next session? And I think I would like to take let's take a 5-minute breather here if we could. So I have 2:54. So let's say at 2:59 we reconvene. And we'll move on to the next slide. Well, if we could, I think if everybody's back, I think that was our 5 minutes. Jason, if you're ready to go, we'll move on to our next discussion item, and that's the brook trout status and conservation.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Kaufman. Yes, today I'm going to cover the status and conservation of brook trout. And this is a quick overview of my presentation. We're going to look at a little bit of information on the Eastern Brook Trout Joint Venture, which will include a review of the status of brook trout, both in the Eastern United States as well as in Pennsylvania, the recent regulation changes to brook trout in Maryland. And next we'll move into covering the brook trout resources here in Pennsylvania, including a review of the former brook trout enhancement regulation program. And finally, we'll take a look at some of the brook trout focused conservation efforts outlined in the strategic plan for the management of trout fisheries in Pennsylvania. Next slide, please. So for those of you who may not be familiar, the Eastern Brook Trout Joint Venture was developed around 15 years ago as part of the National Fish Habitat Action Plan. And it's a partnership between state and federal agencies, regional and local government, businesses, conservation organizations, and others that are working to protect, restore, and enhance brook trout populations and their habitats across their native eastern range. Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission is one of the 17 state fisheries agencies involved, and we're certainly an active member of the Eastern Brook Trout Joint Venture. And really the keystone project of the joint venture has been the range-wide assessment of brook trout status, and this is done roughly on a 5-year rotation. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So this map shows the outcome of the status assessment, the range-wide status assessment. So you can see based on this map that brook trout occur from Georgia all the way up through Maine, and the yellow outline shows the extent of the native Eastern Brook Trout range. And so the colors on this map generally indicate the overall intactness of the brook trout habitat. So the shades of green indicate areas where we have the most intact habitat for brook trout. Shades of red indicate some areas where the habitat and extent of brook trout have been reduced. And then the yellows and grays indicate areas where brook trout no longer occur. So next slide, please. So based on the last range-wide assessment, we can see that roughly about a third of the watersheds as compared to pre-colonial times no longer support brook trout. And there's also quite a few others that where brook trout occupancy is greatly reduced. And so certainly this has identified a need for increased conservation of brook trout habitat throughout their entire native eastern range. And you can certainly see from this map that the brook trout resources really substantially increased from Pennsylvania north to Maine, whereas the overall brook trout resources and the extent of them are considerably smaller from Maryland down south to Georgia. Okay, next slide. So this map shows the occurrence of brook trout throughout Pennsylvania is an output from the last range-wide assessment. So all the little subwatersheds that have various colors on the map indicate where brook trout occurred in Pennsylvania through 2015. And the colors on the map just correspond to whether brook trout are occurring individually in those smaller watersheds or if they're occurring along with other trout species. But you can certainly see from this map that we continue to have good spatial coverage, statewide distribution of brook trout throughout Pennsylvania, with our strongholds occurring across the northern tier. Next slide, please. So next, I'm going to transition into talking a little bit about the brook trout resources in Maryland, and then we'll move into the recent regulation change. So you can see from this map, it's a similar map as to what we just looked at for Pennsylvania that shows the distribution of brook trout throughout Maryland based on the 2015 status assessment. So you can see that the extent of brook trout in Maryland are much reduced as compared to what we saw in Pennsylvania. They're primarily occurring on the far western side of the state, as well as in some patches throughout the middle and eastern part of the state. But certainly a much more retracted distribution overall, and certainly there's been some further more recent reductions to brook trout in Maryland, which is we're going to go ahead and cover next as part of why they've adjusted their angling regulations. So next slide, please. So there's two components to the regulation changes that are implemented now for 2021 in Maryland. The first was catch and release only in all of their put and take, or in other words, their stock trout waters statewide in Maryland. And the second component was catch and release regulations in all of the waters east of Interstate 81. Next slide. So this map, if you take a look, or this slide has a map, and we'll start with that. So the top half of the map shows the state of Maryland. The dark area in gray is the area west of Interstate 81, in which there'll be catch and release for brook trout in their stock trout waters and all of their stock trout waters. And then the area in light gray to the east of Interstate 81, it would show the area where brook trout are catch and release in all of the waters, whether it's an angler's fishing in a stock trout water or a wild trout water. And I should also note while we're talking about this is that, you know, based on the angling regulations for Maryland, anglers can still harvest brook trout in some of their wild trout streams west of Interstate 81. So it's just their stock trout waters that are closed to harvest on the west side of the state. So just a little general overview of you know, again, the overall Maryland's stock and wild trout resources and what are affected by the changes. That Maryland's stock trout program is around 330,000 trout annually. They stock a combination of rainbow and brown trout. There's no brook trout stocked by the state of Maryland, and as you may recall, we've implemented a similar approach over the last number of years. For our stock trout program, we found much better residency with rainbow trout. Rainbow trout are more tolerant of warmer water temperatures, and we also saw the lowest trout residency with brook trout, and we're no longer stocking brook trout into watersheds that contain wild brook trout. So quite similar management approaches on this front. When we take a look at the overall size of the stock trout resource in Maryland, there's about 189 miles of streams and rivers that are managed for stock trout. And of these stream miles, around 9 streams support wild brook trout. So it's a relatively low number of their stock streams support wild brook trout. And if you look at the overall number of wild brook trout streams in Maryland, it's around 1,245, with roughly about half of those miles occurring west of Interstate 81 and half on the eastern side of the state. Okay, next slide. So next, we're going to go over the rationale of why Maryland moved forward with changing regulations on their wild brook trout waters and stocked waters. So the purpose is to eliminate the harvest of brook trout adults in Maryland's most pressured stock trout waters and in the most stressed populations. So results from a 5-year statewide brook trout survey that was done from 2014 through 2018 indicated a 27% additional loss in occupied brook trout watersheds since 1987. And in central Maryland, east of Interstate 81, this is the area that experienced the greatest decline, with about a 20% loss in the occupied watersheds in the Stockton Mountain region and about a 50% loss in the Piedmont region. And the Piedmont region is generally an urban and densely populated area. It's also susceptible to a warmer climate given its lower elevation, which puts additional stressors on the remaining brook trout populations in these areas. Next slide. So harvesting brook trout or any brook trout in central Maryland could have an adverse impact on the populations and the future existence of brook trout in this area. Given the declining populations in central Maryland, Maryland DNR believes that catch and release regulations may help to minimize population impacts from harvest and increase recreational opportunities by increasing the probability of catching a brook trout more than once. However, they've also noted that eliminating harvest will not correct population declines attributed to weather extremes, climate change, and land use changes, which are the primary factors that are resulting in brook trout declines. Next slide. So just to summarize the Maryland change, so brook trout already had a retracted distribution in Maryland, and as I mentioned, they have further declined in the more recent time period, especially east of Interstate 81, and therefore the Maryland DNR implemented catch and release regulations to try and conserve their remaining brook trout populations. Next slide. So next, let's move in and review some of our brook trout resources here in Pennsylvania. So as of 2020, we had around 9,800 miles of streams that support wild brook trout. Our primary threats to brook trout range-wide and here in Pennsylvania are increased water temperatures and habitat degradation. And the decisions that affect land use, water quality, and water quantity, along with climate change, will determine the fate of brook trout far more than angling regulations in most cases. Pennsylvania has a more robust brook trout resource than states to the south, and we are not yet to the point where catch and release regulations are necessary for brook trout statewide or on a regional basis. However, we must work to conserve streams that contain wild brook trout and protect their habitat and water quality from further degradation. And certainly, public education is a key component to conserving our brook trout resources, and we look forward to really ramping up our public education effort as part of our new trout management plan. Next slide, please. So as we've discussed, brook trout we know are sensitive to changes in increased water temperature and habitat degradation. And our streams lower in elevation and those that are already experiencing habitat and water quality impacts from urbanization and agriculture and other sources are certainly those that are most vulnerable to climate change. Brook trout populations in the southeast part of the state, as well as in northwest Pennsylvania, are likely to be at a higher risk of decline due to urbanization and agriculture and other land use changes, as well as climate change. And the map that's included on this slide, the areas that are shown in yellow and red show areas that are higher risk of habitat degradation for brook trout, whereas areas of the state that's in blue or purple indicate areas that have a lower risk of habitat degradation. And certainly fishery monitoring is absolutely key and will provide us the necessary information to guide our future management decisions moving forward. Next slide. So next I wanted to go over the evaluation of catch and release regulations on brook trout in Pennsylvania. So our brook trout regulation program is called the Brook Trout Enhancement Regulation Program. It was implemented from 2004 through 2011, and we evaluated it on 16 stream sections located across Pennsylvania. The regulation program as a whole did not increase the abundance of legal size, which would be 7-inch and larger brook trout in our study waters. However, in one watershed, the Upper Kettle Creek watershed located in Potter County, this was an outlier in the study, and the abundance of legal size 7-inch and larger brook trout did increase in this watershed, and therefore the catch and release regulations were retained. So we kept this watershed under catch and release regulations based on the results of the study. So Kettle Creek was certainly the largest stream that was involved in the study, and it's a destination water that receives higher angler use than other study waters. And because it receives higher angler use, these are the type of waters which you would expect for a special regulation to have a biological benefit. It should be noted next that, most brook trout streams here in Pennsylvania, as well as, throughout most of their eastern range are small, they're brushy, and they receive limited angler use. And we know from our past angler use and harvest surveys that most wild trout anglers are currently practicing catch and release. Other moderate-sized streams, in addition to Kettle Creek, that receive higher angler use are already managed under special regulations. A couple examples of these would be Big Spring Creek in Cumberland County and Fishing Creek in Clayton County. Next slide. Next, I'd like to just talk a little bit about our strategic plan for the management of trout fisheries in Pennsylvania, or more commonly referred to as our trout management plan. So we certainly know that wild brook trout are at the forefront of fisheries management in Pennsylvania, and they're our primary focus of this plan. 17 of the 22 wild trout issues identified in the plan have a brook trout focus. Well, I'm not going to cover all these. I would like to mention a few of them here today. These strategies would include identification of new wild trout and Class A wild trout stream sections, so that the habitat and water quality can be protected in these streams, and that these streams can be properly managed. This also includes development of strategies for addressing climate change, which would include identifying areas that have higher resiliency, especially on the brook trout front, areas where water temperature is likely to stay colder over the extended period. Conducting updated angler use and harvest surveys on wild trout waters statewide. This is going to provide us with important information for managing our wild trout fisheries. Implementing a long-term wild trout monitoring program. This will be building from our existing wild trout monitoring that's conducted annually, and we look forward to really expanding this program across the state. And as I mentioned previously, we've increased the numbers of rainbow trout that are stocked at the same time as reducing the number of brook trout that are stocked. And we're no longer stocking brook trout into watersheds that support wild brook trout, and we're not stacking hatchery trout into streams that support moderate to strong wild brook trout populations. And finally, development of a stocking authorization to better manage where trout are being stocked. Next slide. So to summarize, that brook trout are sensitive to increased water temperature and habitat degradation, and that protecting streams that contain wild brook trout from degradation in habitat or water quality is the most important component of management. Pennsylvania continues to support a robust wild brook trout resource, and our trout management plan will focus considerable staff resources on brook trout management over the next several years, and will provide a solid platform to adaptively manage brook trout into the future. And that concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Jason. Any comments, discussion on the discussion items from any of the other commissioners?
This is Commissioner Charlesworth. Jason, I have a couple questions for you. Let's talk climate change first. From all indications, climate change is only going to get worse over the years. Am I correct?
That's what most of the models are suggesting, is that we are going to see increases in air temperature, which will likely correspond to increases in water temperature. That's correct.
And probably habitat is going to be diminished by expansion of urban areas and things like that, correct?
That's a possibility. It certainly will depend on the decisions that are made that will affect what land use changes occur.
So, and to sum it up, it's only going to get worse. For me, what I see with what we're doing as a program is that we're managing the population to remain at status quo. Between now and 200 years ago, is the brook trout population substantially reduced?
The status of brook trout throughout their entire eastern range has been reduced as compared to pre-colonial times. I think that's been pretty well established. And to address the other part of the question is that we're actually seeing increases in wild trout distribution across the state. Some of this is a function of our increased sampling efforts through the unassessed waters program over the last 10 years, but we're also seeing some really good news stories coming from things like acid minor drainage remediation, where we're seeing range expansions of brook trout occurring naturally. We're also seeing some reduced impacts from acid precipitation that have been a benefit from improved regulations for air quality and emissions, and certainly some of the long-term benefits from the Clean Water Act. So in terms of where brook trout are now today in Pennsylvania, perhaps as compared to where they were maybe even a couple decades ago, all in all, we've really seen some improvements, but certainly to keep them at a higher level and to keep their populations hopefully expanding, then that's going to take a lot of continued effort.
Well, this is just my point of view. If climate and habitat is going to be degraded even more, why are we not making all Class A trout streams catch and release? Class A brook, Class A brown. I mean, again, that's just my opinion. If things are going to get worse, why don't we start protecting all of our Class A streams by putting in a catch and release regulation?
I think it's really important to note here that the main potential impacts of brook trout moving forward are degradations to water quality and habitat, and unfortunately, catch and release regulation or any angling regulation for that matter isn't going to address the root cause of why we're seeing reductions in brook trout throughout their range. And so as we're moving forward with management of brook trout, we or any management decisions, we're really trying to get to the root cause of why a particular stream or a particular population or at a broader scale may be declining, and oftentimes this is harder to get at. It's harder to make improvements at a watershed scale versus perhaps making a regulatory change. But if we're really going to do right by brook trout, it's going to come on protecting and conserving water quality in the habitats where they occur.
Well, why can't we do both at the same time? Why don't we work on habitat and water quality and protect the wild trout population by implementing some kind of program as far as regulations are concerned? Again, that's all my questions. Thanks for answering, Jason. Appreciate it.
Charlie, this is Eric Hussar. Yeah, and this is something I guess we'll be discussing, in the future. And I would challenge us, the commission, the public, all our partners, into taking a critical look at this with some urgency and protecting and conserving and enhancing these. This was on the brook trout. But all the other species, that the wild browns, the few wild rainbows we have. I mean, these are fragile wild trout fisheries. Charlie, like you said, managing it with the status quo, I don't feel is something that's going to benefit these fisheries 30, 40, 50 years from now. And if we can make a difference collectively, we can make a difference. And, you know, it's going to take some leadership and bold decision-making on it. But, Jason, just quick, I mean, I have a report. When was that report done? 2010? Is that the same one I have on the brook trout, the enhancement program? Was that 2010?
There's been a couple iterations, Commissioner Assar. The first was done in 2006. I believe there was one around that 2010, 2012 timeline, and then there was 2015, and the next, there's another range-wide assessment that will likely be done either later this year or early next year. So there's been a series of reports that have come out and looking at the status of brook trout and identifying the common reasons for their decline across the historic range. So I'm not exactly sure which one you're referring to, but
well, I have yeah, I do have two of them in front of me, so I'm just I'm trying to discern the dates on them, but okay.
Jason,
I mean, look, I've read reports. I mean, I have data in front of me that harvest has been shown to have been a factor in decline of brook trout populations. I've read reports where part of that is the brook trout are easy to catch and they're vulnerable to mortality for either harvest or hooking, and you know, it's just. I think the public as a whole, including us, including staff and everybody probably on this phone, I think we all support some type of, you know, there is a social and economic importance of these fish. It's our state fish. We do have the browns and the brooks or the rainbows too in these selective streams. And again, circling back to what I initially said, I think the challenge is for us to take a critical look at this going forward. Thanks.
Eric, this is Chris. To answer your question, the documents that were provided to you in advance of the meeting were the North American Journal of Fisheries Management peer-reviewed article that was published based on the Fish and Boat Commission research in 2014, and the internal fisheries management report in 2013. To also get at some of the discussion that's ongoing right now, I'll say that, you know, as Jason pointed out, the Trout Plan, I think, is a very forward-thinking, ambitious document that addresses a lot of focus onto our brook trout populations as well as our wild trout populations in general. And also, as Jason pointed out, there's a lot of limiting factors out there that are apart from harvest. What we know and what we have in front of us is that harvest is not playing a major factor in our wild trout fisheries. However, it does in some cases, as illustrated in some of the examples that Jason pointed out, in our high-use, high-profile waters like Big Spring and Fishing Creek, and that's why special regulations are applied to those. And special regulations in general are applied to waters that have high use and have high potential for angler use. So I would just say at this point, I mean, the implications of a proposal or any suggestion of advancing a regulation on catch and release across the board is very far-reaching. So I'm going to hold comment until we have opportunity to fully evaluate its merit on its potential impacts. Certainly look forward to the opportunity to provide a comprehensive overview to commissioners on this topic to allow you the opportunity to consider the technical expertise and recommendations of Commission staff when deciding upon the fate of this proposal.
Well, yeah, and Chris, I get that. I'm not sure. Do we even know what the estimated angler use is on this stream? So I know we're making conclusions. Do we have specific counts? I guess my point is, Chris, how can we conclude that the angler has, use of it has no impact when we're only looking at the fish populations, and we don't know what they're actually. Are sections getting wiped out that we don't know about? I would suggest they could. And again, this is. I don't want to get into too much detail right now at this point with it, but I understand what you said there about looking forward. As long as we're all doing this together, looking forward, that'll be.
Yeah, and Eric, this is Rick.
We need to do.
Yeah. Thanks, Eric. I want to thank both you and Charlie for bringing that up, because I had the same thought in mind too. And as you said earlier, I think we need to take leadership, continue this discussion with staff, and as Chris said, we'll work it out. So let's keep this on the table and keep moving forward with it. I think it's an important thing for us to consider as we, as you said, look 30, 50 years ahead.
Chairman,
Don Anderson,
Rick,
this is one comment that I'd like to make.
All right, go ahead. I'll go after him.
Go ahead, Don.
Okay, Jason or Chris, I'll pose this question to you two. When our people are out doing the survey work on the unassessed waters, are we making any kind of notations about the habitat there? When we talk about habitat degradation, and we look at, probably the greatest effect there on brook trout would be warming water. And I know a lot of small streams that get low flows in the summertime. If you have just a couple 100 feet of area where it's daylighted, where you've done away with the shade canopy over that stream, you can easily warm water up 2 or 3 degrees, if not more, in just a couple 100 feet if it's not shaded. I guess my concern would be a lot of waters where we have documented good brook trout populations. Should we be trying to do more with landowners there, and making sure that there's trees replanted and that those areas become shaded or stay shaded to protect the thermal issue with those streams? I know sometimes there's areas that get timbered and a shade canopy is lost on different streams. I've seen that already, and maybe we should be trying to do more to get quick growing trees planted right along the banks and that to get that shade canopy restored if it's been lost.
Yes, Commissioner Anderson, to answer your question, as part of all stream surveys that we conduct, we do what's called a rapid bioassessment protocol. And we assess the in-stream and riparian habitat along each electrofishing site that we do. We also collect water quality information during every electrofishing survey, basic information regarding temperature, pH, alkalinity, so on and so forth. And we use that information to identify those opportunities that you mentioned for improvement, and do so when resources allow.
Okay, good. Thanks.
Don, that was Don. This is Don. That was Eric. That was a good point. Again, looking forward strategically with this, and long term, I think is. It's critical. So that's another strategic area we should definitely look at.
That's what brought it up in that. So I think that's something we need to really focus on here in the future.
Chairman Kaufman, this is Richard.
Yeah, you had a
Commissioner
point.
Lewis, I just, I'll make one or two quick comments. One is that the studies we're talking about are, I think, 7 years old now, even at 14. So I'm hopeful that we might have another study. I think Chris said they were planning on more in 2021 to check out this theory that that catch and release regulations don't really have an impact on brook trout populations. Second of all, as we move forward in this discussion, and there has been comment about holding another meeting to focus in on this more solely and really dig into it a little bit. I would like the staff to go back to Maryland and ask a couple more questions. Number one is, I believe I heard that the take limit in the western part of the state was reduced or is reduced down to, I want to say, 2 fish, 2 brook trout. I'd like you to check and see whether that is something that's either correct or incorrect. And third or second, I know that the Savage River State Forest, which is 55,000 acres, is a big chunk of either Allegheny, maybe not Allegheny, Garrett County. Brook trout harvest is prohibited on that whole state forest. I've heard that. I'd like you to check to see whether that's correct and whether any of the other state forests in Maryland, including the Green Ridge, which is another huge one, has a similar prohibition against take. So those are my comments, and I've pledged to Eric that we will continue to look into this in depth. I understand that I have Eric's passion about brook trout, and also Charlie's and some of the other commissioners, but I'm hoping we can come up with some kind of a proposal that would be embraced by both the commissioners and the staff that would do more than we're doing now. And I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks, Richard. Okay, any other comments? Jason, thank you very much for your presentation. Let's turn it over to Dave. Yep, well, I'm sorry.
Can I ask a couple questions?
Sure, Dan. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Dan.
I just had 2 questions. So the first was on going back to page 42 of the PowerPoint. The second bullet says the regulation that the program didn't increase the abundance of legal size brook trout in study waters. Did the study look at whether there was an increase in brook trout overall of any size, or did it solely look at whether there was a increase in the abundance of fish over 7 inches?
We looked at the overall changes in whether there was changes in the adult population as a whole, such as like fish perhaps over 4 inches and larger, 100 millimeters, and there weren't any changes in these systems. Again, these are small headwater streams that are primarily relegated by the environmental factors that are occurring there.
Okay. And then my second question, I guess it's more of an observation, but if you go back to page 41, sorry, let me find it. I'm sorry, it's on page 40. So if you look on page 40 at the 4th bullet point, it says we have a more robust trout resource, and we're not yet to the point where catch and release are necessary for brook trout statewide or regionally. But then when I look at the next page, 41, and I look at the northwest part of the state where my district is. Am I correct that what I'm seeing is this area is a very high risk of habitat degradation? And so I'm just trying to reconcile, like, you know, we're not there yet, but yet we're at least in this area, at a very high risk of habitat degradation, which is, as you said, one of the most impactful factors for the population. So I'm just struggling to reconcile. If we're not there yet in my region, what more has to happen before we're at a point we need to do something?
Yes, so the map you're referring to, that analysis that was done was done, and what's pictured shows what the risk would be, whether or not that there's brook trout occurring there. And so most of that northwestern part of the state, there's not brook trout occurring there. Anyway, they've been lost or extirpated, decades or more ago. So certainly, though, in general, obviously the northwest and southwest part of the state generally aren't as mountainous as the central locations, and that's, as you can see through a lot of the range, the areas that would have greater or more mountains or and less agriculture and less development would be areas that would have lower risk to habitat degradation. So certainly what it's showing is that for the remaining populations that would exist in northwest and southeast Pennsylvania, in general, those areas do have the potential for higher risk from habitat degradation and potentially climate change.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I really appreciate the presentation.
Hey, Rick, are you there?
Yep, I'm here, Eric. Go ahead.
Just one more comment, and again, I don't want to belabor extend this meeting any much longer, other than I'm looking at that report, Chris, you referred to, the North, what was that called again? The North, Chris, you referred to one of the reports.
North American Journal of Fisheries Management.
Yeah, and I'll just conclude. I mean, there's a statement in there, and it says an angler survey of 200 wild trout streams in Pennsylvania during 2004 found that anglers released 90% of the total catch, and exploitation of legal-sized trout was estimated at 8% for brook trout. You know, I could put it another way and say 7% of the anglers don't release their catch, and the regulations could have saved 7% of those fish statewide in the populations. And I guess it gets back to my initial comments. If we could save 1% of these fish with all the other suppressors that are affecting them, that would be, in my opinion, a worthy cause. So that's all I got to say, Rick. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Eric. Okay.
Eric, this is Commissioner Charles Worth. Could I ask a question for Chris Coons?
Sure.
Chris, there were two non-agency reports on brook trout research done by Penn State University. One was a doctoral student, last name White. Don't know what her first name was. And the other one was Sarah Miller. Is there any way we can obtain copies of those reports?
Yeah, we can look into that with the authors.
Okay, Shannon White. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I've seen. Well, actually, the Sarah Miller, I actually raised the money to help finance that research. So I know a little bit about her research, but Shannon, I don't know, and I'd like to see that.
Sure, we can talk offline, Charlie, and I know that Shannon's published more than one I believe, article. So we can determine which one it is and go from there.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. Moving on. Dave Nyhart, your turn. And next slide, please.
All right, good afternoon, Commissioners. The next discussion item we're going to talk about, there's going to be 2 discussions on select fisheries topics that will be covered in greater detail at the April Commission meeting. The first discussion item we'll go over is the creation of a slot limit regulation program for trout. And as like many of the other issues that have been addressed so far in this meeting, this issue is tied back into our strategic plan for the management of trout fisheries, as Chris indicated, was finalized in October. Specifically, this will look at issue 16. Issue 16 states, there may be an opportunity to provide anglers with an increased opportunity to harvest intermediate-sized trout while having the dual benefit of improving the size structure of wild trout populations by protecting some of the larger trout from harvest on some of our more productive streams in the state. So a pilot study was done on Penns Creek, Section 3. The study was done from 2014 through 2019. And at that time, it evaluated the slot limit regulation. This regulation allowed the use of all tackle, and as part of the slot limit, harvest was restricted to 2 trout per day, and the fish harvested had to be greater than or equal 7 inches to less than 12 inches in length. Fish could be harvested from the opening day of trout through Labor Day. It was open to fishing the remainder of the year, so basically the day after Labor Day to opening day, fishing was permitted on a catch and release basis. Information gained through the Penns Creek Evaluation has led staff to believe that a formal slot limit regulation program could be applied to other waters statewide. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the Penns Creek Evaluation, and again, a lot of this is stuff that you guys have heard previously. As a result of the slot limit regulation being placed on Section 3 of Penns Creek during our electrofishing surveys, we noticed increase in catch rates of brown trout greater than or equal to 16 inches in length following the implementation of the slot limit. As mentioned before, previously this section was managed as trophy trout all tackle. We did not see a change in the abundance of brown trout less than or greater than or equal to 7 inches to less than 12 inches in length following the implementation of the slot limit. Again, this is the size of the range of fish that were available to harvest, so we did not detect any great changes in the number of fish that were eligible to be harvested. Results from the Angler Use and Harvest Survey that was done in 2019 showed low harvest that occurred, and we had also noticed we had high angler support for continuing the slot limit regulation, not only on Penns Creek, but potentially expanding the use of this slot limit regulation to some of our other productive streams throughout the state. Next slide, please. So staff are looking at the possibility of 2 sub-programs to be included into the slot limit regulation. The first sub-program would be all tackle trout slot limit. Again, this is what was included in miscellaneous regulations that were applied to Penns Creek Section 3. In addition, we would have a second sub-program that would be the artificial lures only trout slot limit program. We feel that two sub-programs will provide the ability to select the best tackle option to achieve biological and social objectives on each specific water container that would be considered for inclusion into one of these programs. To date, staff have and are continuing to identify waters that could potentially be included into this program, including both sub-programs. Next slide, please. So what would the proposed trout slot limit regulations be? Again, these waters are open to year-round fishing. Depending on the sub-program, if the water is put into the all-tackle program, all tackle types will be permitted. If a water is chosen to be permitted into the catch and release sub-program, fishing would be done with artificial lures only. Again, these would be the same regulations that artificial lures only regulations that some of our other special regulation waters are managed under. From 8 a.m. on opening day of trout season through Labor Day, the daily krill limit would be 2 trout combined species per day. Trout must be at least 7 inches in length and less than 12 inches in length to be killed or had in possession. From the day after Labor Day until 8 a.m. of the opening day of trout season, no trout may be killed or had in possession. And a current trout and salmon permit would be required to fish in stream sections managed under these special regulations. And that's the last slide I have for this presentation.
Thanks, Dave. Any questions?
Just and Tim, you can answer this for me. This is Eric, Tim. We no longer have the salmon permit, is that correct? It's just trout?
Right, yeah, the term salmon was removed as a part of Act 56 last year.
Good, okay, thank you.
I have a question. This is Richard. This is Commissioner Lewis. Eric, you're familiar with these slot regulations because you fish in an area where they're used or applied. Can you tell us from your personal fishing experience how you feel about the success or lack of thereof of this regulation?
Sure, Richard. Well, that whole stream section 3 is quite the success story from, I believe it was 1992 when we stopped stocking it to the trophy trout regs, and now through the slot limit the last 7 years. Is that survey, is our results going to be given out to the commissioners, Dave, on the Creel survey? Have they seen that?
I'm not sure what information has been relayed to them, but we can circle back with staff and check the status of the Creel survey results.
I think it'd be a value for the commissioners to see that survey in comparison to the one we did. I believe it was 2000. When was the prior one done? 2013. Okay.
Correct.
I think that'd be value for the commissioners to see that. Now the fishery itself it worked. It's worked in the drought of 2016. After my recent trip out there last weekend, and despite the drought we had this past year in 2020, the fishery is just as good as it gets. And it was sketchy all summer through the fall. Fortunately, we had good temperatures this fall that pushed water temperatures down. However, the water flows were extremely low, but with this high water and looking what the fish conditions are, the size of the fish, the abundance of them, the abundance of that mid-sized fish, it's extraordinary in my eyes, but from what we're seeing. So it definitely had an impact there. I guess the question is, again, it's most anglers now there are practicing catch and release more so than they did in 2013, more so than they did in 2000, more so than they did in 20 prior to that. And we're catching larger fish, fish in that trophy. It was mentioned in one of our slides before. I believe Chris did that 18-inch fish is common there now. It was not a common fish to catch prior to the slot limit being put in place. Very rare to get an 18-inch fish there. They were being harvested. So that's it in a nutshell. So,
thank you, Eric. I'd like to suggest, based upon what you said, that if we haven't done this already, that we consider an article, 1 or 2 pages in the Pennsylvania Angler and Boater, talking about the success of this particular management regime and taking a look at what other streams it might be applied on.
Anything else in this item? Not, Dave, we'll continue to the next one.
Okay, thank you. So the next discussion item that we'll also be discussed in greater detail at the April Commission meeting is an amendment to PA Code 6526, which is the extended trout season. Again, this was identified as an issue in the Trout Plan, specifically Issue 27. Issue 27 states the stock trout program is one of the Commission's most popular programs, and the Commission must work to improve stock trout stream angling opportunities and experiences to best meet the preferences of the anglers. And one of the strategies as a way to address this issue is, by 2022, add the section limits for stock trout streams to the Summary of Fishing Regulations and Laws booklet. And this is kind of how we provide this information in other various platforms, whether it's through our Fish and Boat app or those folks referencing stock trout waters through our county guide portal on our website. So it would line up with how we do things in various other ways. Most stock trout streams are not stocked throughout their entire length, and many of these stream sections also have sections that are managed for wild trout. So by providing section limits in the summary book, it really will provide many benefits, we feel, for not only the anglers, but potentially the resource as well. So we'll get into them in some additional details. Next slide, please. So one opportunity would be a way to provide an opportunity to simplify the regulations. So in 6526, the extended trout season, it reads, the extended trout season is in effect from the day after Labor Day until the last day of February on following year on stock trout waters and all waters downstream of stock trout waters. Again, so the amendment that we would be looking at is we would like to amend 6526 and do amend the all waters downstream of stock trout waters. So currently, if a stream section is stocked in Section 2, it falls into the extended trout season, and subsequently all water sections downstream of Section 2, due to their proximity of a stock trout section, also are part of the extended trout season. So we feel that this is not necessary, and providing the limits to our stock trout limits in the Summary of Laws booklet will allow us to clean this up as well. The bullet point down below, you can see that right now we stock 701 stream sections across the Commonwealth. 281 of them, or so roughly 40% of all the stock streams that we stock throughout the state, are not stocked to the mouth, meaning that there's portions below stock trout stream limits to the mouth that are falling into the extended season, but are not actively being managed as a stock trout fishery. Next slide, please. The next benefit, it'll clearly identify where stocking is occurring to increase angler participation, especially for anglers unfamiliar with a particular stream. You can see here is a picture. It's a cutout of our summary book. And just one example, looking at Berks County, the very first stream you see is Antietam Creek. So somebody not familiar with Antietam Creek in Berks County may assume that the entire stretch of Antietam Creek is stocked. That is not true. Currently, just one example, we stock Section 2 of Antietam Creek. Sections 1 and 3 are not stocked. So to the person that's not familiar with that area, they may go to a section of Antietam Creek expecting to find a stock trout fishery that may not exist because they're not unsure of where the limits are. So providing those limits would definitely benefit the angler choosing to fish in a stock trout water. And you can see, just looking over at Chester Creek, Buck Run, I'm not sure if you can read it or not, but for that particular stream, we provide the limits of where we stock. So again, by providing the limits for every stream section that we stock, would make it more consistent across the board. So again, there are very, very few streams that we stock from the headwaters to the mouth. So by providing these limits in the summary book, it will allow anglers to know where to target stock fish. Next slide, please. The next benefit, we feel, to provide increased protection to stream sections managed for wild trout during the extended season. Again, all waters downstream of stock trout sections are part of the extended season. So from the day after Labor Day through the end of February, these stream sections are open to harvest of trout. So by defining the section limits, we feel that in doing away with the portion of the extended season that applies to all waters downstream, we definitely afford some additional allow for some additional protection to stream sections that are not stocked. So this watershed here, you can see, if you look at the green line on the bottom left-hand corner of the stream, this represents a roughly 7.5-mile section of a water that we stock. This is the only section of this water that we stock. But by being downstream of a stock trout section, you have roughly 90 miles of stream that is part of the extended season. We've recently received a petition and had some other correspondence about finding additional ways to protect wild fish that may be using a larger system moving in and out of tributaries for whether it's a seasonal movement looking to spawn somewhere or seeking cool water refuge. There needs to be some level or some mechanism that the fishing boat has to protect these fish. So here you can see the dark yellow gold lines are stream sections within this watershed that are either currently designated as Class A or wild trout. So you can see they're kind of scattered throughout the length of the section. So potentially these fish are dropping down into the larger system and moving throughout various times of the year. And again, by being downstream of a stock section, they are included, the blue line is included in the extended season. So there's the opportunity for individuals to harvest some of these wild trout that are moving throughout this larger system after Labor Day through the beginning of the year or through the end of February. So this would be one way that we have without putting in a regulation, a special regulation in place that could provide some additional protection to these wild fish that are moving through stream sections that are downstream of the stock trout water. Next slide, please. The last benefit, we feel that it will increase angler opportunities for wild trout and warm, cool water species in sections that are open to year-round fishing. So here you can see the dark green line is a stream section that is stocked. So by regulation, stock trout stream sections are closed from March 1st to the opening day of trout. And then this also applies to waters downstream of stocked waters. So the blue line, which we do not stock, in this case flows through a metropolitan area that may provide, in this case, a warm, cool water recreational fishery, would be closed to angling from March 1st to opening day due to the fact that it's downstream of a stock section. So by defining the limits and doing away with the all sections downstream of a stock trout water in the extended season regulation, this portion of water would be open to fishing during the March time period, essentially creating an additional, depending on where this water is located in the state, anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks of additional angling opportunities in these areas that may have a warm, cool water species, a warm, cool water fishery below a stock section. And that is the last slide I have.
Any questions for Dave?
Yeah, it's Richard. I'm still a little confused on this. If there are trout in a non-stock trout stream, kind of warm water stream below these sections, will they be allowed to be harvested from September on? Or what I'm trying to understand is there a different limit here? From September through February, are you allowed to take 3 fish, and then from February to March, whatever it is, from March 1st to opening day, you can't take any fish? I'm not sure I understand this, so try to help me out.
Okay, so currently how it is, stock trout waters and all waters downstream of stock trout waters fall into the extended season. Mm-hmm. So during that time period, which runs from the day after Labor Day through the end of February, trout can still be harvested at 3 per day compared to the 5 per day during trout season. So they can still be harvested just at a reduced rate. So if we amend 6526 and amend the language of all sections downstream of stock trout waters, essentially those stream sections downstream of where we currently stock would be, harvest would be prohibited from the day after Labor Day through the opening day of trout season. So yes,
Okay.
additional protection would be provided to wild trout or any trout that are caught in those stream sections.
Okay, thank you. That's what I was trying to determine. Thank you very much.
Well, you're welcome.
And this is Eric Hussar, that would pertain to the petition we received, correct? That section?
Some of the issues that were brought up in the petition was finding a way to protect fish that are moving in systems that were currently not stocked, but were below stock trout sections. So yes, in that regard, it would. It would
Yeah,
address,
that's
it
what
would
I meant.
eliminate
Yeah.
a lot of the concerns that were laid out in the petition.
Got it. Thanks, Steve.
That's my understanding
Thank
too,
you.
Eric. My understanding is that this provision it's not exactly what the petition with 1,200 signatures asked for, but I have a feeling, in fact, I know that if this carries through, it will satisfy the goal that petition had, which was try to protect those migratory brown trout in waters that are not traditionally thought of as trout waters.
Yes, Commissioner Lewis, this is Chris. I would just note that this initiative and this proposed amendment to eliminate the language of all waters downstream of stock trout waters is part of the strategic plan for trout management and has been on our radar for some time, well before the petition. But yes, it would help to protect, and I think it falls in line with what the petition's intent is as we perceive it, that it would help with protection of fish that may move into a larger stream system during the winter when water temperatures cool down to their thermal tolerance. So it would protect those fish.
This is Commissioner Charlesworth again. Let's examine just one scenario. Let's take the Lackawanna as an example. The upper section of Lackawanna near Simpson is stock trout water. Then it drops down into a Class A section, and it's Class A all the way down to almost the last fishable part of the river. They have acid mine drainage coming in the last 2 or 3 miles of the river, but between there is non-stocked trout water, but it's not any classification as far as wild trout are concerned. So does that apply through the entire length then of the change? The entire length of the river?
Yeah, so currently what we're working towards is only having the extended season apply to sections that are managed or sections that are stocked with hatchery trout. So all sections downstream of there would not have the extended season regulations would not apply to them, regardless if it's sectioned in between 2 Class A sections or whatever the case may be.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
And again, they could fish. It's catch and release during that period, just like it, right? I mean, they can fish that water, but it's catch and release at that, just like it is in, right? Okay.
Correct.
So it is open for fishing, and good, very good.
Another question: What is it going to cost to publish all those river sections? That guidebook is going to be huge.
Well, it's something staff is certainly addressed and is working to address, and that was one of the first things that popped into our mind is what's it going to take to do this. So staff have been in the process now for many months trying to find a way to minimize the additions to the summary book. But again, this will match up with everything else that's being out there, whether it's on our website or or on apps or whatever, so it would keep it consistent. So the angler picking up a summary book will have the same information as to the individual using an app on their phone.
I would think it would be a good educational tool for our WCOs to use, just in talking to people that may be on those sections during certain periods of the year, and educating them on it will have a positive impact too. So that would be beneficial.
Okay, anything else for Dave? All right, let's move on to the next slide. Thank you, Dave. And a couple things to wrap up here. Chris, take it away on Virtual Fisheries Summit announcement.
So yes, I just wanted to take this opportunity to make an announcement of a planned event that we have for Saturday, February 20th. So if some of you recall, in 2017, the Fish and Boat Commission conducted or put on a virtual trout summit, and that was very well attended, and we had a lot of informative staff presentations related to trout. And so in thinking about whether there's a need or desire to conduct another trout summit, we realized that, you know, we have a lot of very diverse fisheries here in Pennsylvania. We're blessed with vast wild trout resources, stock trout resources, but we also have very, very world-class resources pertaining to smallmouth bass. We have excellent muskie fishing opportunities, walleyes, so on and so forth, catfish. So our intent is to have a series of staff presentations overview of management and angling opportunities for various different species, say for walleye, catfish, muskie, different species that we don't normally think of, say migratory species in the Delaware like striped bass, American shad, panfish in lakes or warm water streams. So we're fleshing out the details on exactly the format and other things, but it will be virtual given the pandemic and the restrictions associated with that. But we're optimistic that we'll get a lot of interest in this, and looking forward to being able to provide an informative day of outlining the diverse angling opportunities and fisheries we have here in Pennsylvania. So look for that here coming soon. We'll be putting out some outreach on that and announcements as plans develop, but the date is set for Saturday, February 20th.
Chris, do you have a time frame set up, or is that still in the works?
We don't have that established just yet, but it would likely start somewhere around 9 or 10 in the morning and go through 2 or 3 in the afternoon, 4 o'clock, depending on the number of presentations that we have. And we'll have the agenda published on our website and available, so folks can see what they may be interested in and tune in for that portion of it, or tune in for all of it.
Well, I think that's a great idea. I think this could be a really big hit. I think it could build on the excitement that we had the previous year. And, you know, we're still all homebound pretty much. And I think this could be a really big hit. So I applaud you in putting it together. Great idea. And just got to do a bang up job of advertising it across the state. I think it really worked out great.
This is Commissioner Lewis. I agree with you. I think based upon my experience at the last trout summit we had a couple of years ago, there was a lot of good attendance and a lot of interest. Chris, do you plan to group the presentations by species so that, or do you have some other way that you'll format it?
Yes, for example, say we would have a presentation on walleye management in lakes and rivers, we could have a presentation on catfish management and fishing opportunities for the various species of catfish. We will have a presentation on black bass opportunities in lakes, and perhaps one on black bass in rivers. So yes, we would group them by species or species group.
That's good, because that way people that have an interest in specific species, but not either the interest or the opportunity to fish for other ones, could tune in for an hour or so to catch that segment, but not have to sit there all day. That's an excellent plan. I think it's fantastic.
Yeah, and this is Tim Schaefer. I just wanted to thank staff and commissioners and point out to you that this is another example of something that we have laid out specifically in the strategic plan that the commissioners approved last summer. The Fisheries Summit was in there for 2021. All the great work that people have been going over throughout this meeting that's in the Trout Plan, a lot of thought went into it, and I just want the commissioners to know that those plans are already dog-eared. They're used on a daily basis, not only by the staff within Fisheries, but folks in bureaus throughout the agency that have some sort of supporting role for all the implementation of all these things. So just again, thanks to staff for a great job of putting the plans together and for being really adaptable and proactive on the execution.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Nothing else from Chris. So move into new business. Commissioners, committee people, anything you'd like to bring up before we wrap up everything?
I'm good.
Okay, hearing no new business. Tim, anything before we turn it over to Wayne to talk about the next commission meeting? Anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, just again, thanks to the staff and the commissioners. Thanks to the folks who are listening in. We've got a pretty ambitious agenda here this year and years to come, and just really grateful for everything we're doing. And if there are folks listening in on the line, thank you for what you did in 2020, and looking into 2021. We're hoping for another great year on the water. We will be having some presentations on additional topics during the commission meeting on the 25th. So Wayne will identify more details about that, but just stay tuned, and we look forward to welcoming people back and looking at the calendar in 18 days.
Tim, this is Richard. Commissioner Lewis, one more time, just one thing. I want to just compliment the staff and the commissioners as your president, in that I am really delighted with the way our committee structures are now starting to work. I think that the COVID-19 has had a lot of bad things that it's caused, but one of the good things is that we have reactivated our committees. The committees are meeting virtually, and I feel that we're actually moving along just as well, if not better, than the old format where we used to meet face-to-face in 2 days. I really am very pleased with the way the committees are structured, the way they're working, and the way that ideas and concepts are being passed out of committee up to the board. So that's my comment. Thank you, and to everybody, please be safe until the next time we meet.
Tim, this is Rick. I have another question. For those who might not have been able to be with us this afternoon, will this be recorded and on our website?
Yeah, and I'll repeat the meeting, the announcement before. The meeting will be immediately available on the Facebook page after this ends, and then a recording will be posted on our YouTube page within a few days. So yes, it will be available.
All right, just want to reiterate that for everyone. Wayne?
Thank you. Commissioners, as was previously announced, your next quarterly meeting will take place on January 25th, 2021. I will confirm that because of continuing COVID precautions, this meeting will again be held in a virtual format. Commissioners, we've reached the end of our agenda, so do I hear a motion to adjourn?
So moved. Commissioner Lewis, so moved.
I'll
Mr.
second
Anderson,
that.
second.
Okay, you got it.
All right, we have a motion and a second. All those in favor signify by saying yes.
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 Opposed? Thank you all for your attendance. This meeting is now adjourned.